Let's raise the whole question again of this ongoing debate about trans athletes in women's sport, because obviously it highlights the physical disparity between men and women. Martina Navratilova, a former number one, obviously like yourself, says it's wrong for the Women's Tennis Association to allow trans women to compete in its events. Do you agree with her?
Well, that's a tricky question. I have nothing to do against them, but I feel like they still got huge advantage over the woman. And I think it's just not fair to a woman to basically face like the biologically man. And then it's, it's not fair. Like the woman been working the whole life to reach her limit. And then she has to face like a man, like which biologically much stronger. So for me, I don't agree with this kind of stuff in sport.
The room felt like it was collapsing inward as Brittney Griner's voice finally broke. Cameras were already rolling when it happened, catching the exact second her composure shattered under the weight of a sentence that never should have crossed into the WNBA conversation. A reporter repeated the quote slowly, almost carefully, but there was no soft way to deliver it. Aryna Sabalenka had publicly demanded that trans players be banned from the WNBA. Not debated. Not discussed. Banned. Brittney froze, eyes glassy, jaw trembling as the words landed like a punch to the chest. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the room erupted, murmurs, gasps, phones lighting up as social media began to combust in real time. This wasn't just an opinion drifting in from another sport. This was an explosive statement detonating inside a league built on inclusion, identity, and survival. Brittney tried to answer. She really did. But her voice cracked, and suddenly the strongest presence in the room looked unbearably human. Years of battles, protests, sacrifices, and pain flashed across her face as she whispered, "You don't get to erase people like that." Tears spilled. Not performative. Not controlled. Raw. Within minutes, clips went viral. Headlines twisted. Fans chose sides with brutal speed. Some praised bold honesty. Others called it violence disguised as commentary. The WNBA, once again, found itself at the center of a cultural war it didn't ask for, with Brittney Griner standing in the crossfire. And as the backlash surged, one terrifying question hung in the air. Was this about to become the most divisive crisis the league had ever faced? Long before that question shattered the room, Brittney Griner had already lived a lifetime inside controversy. Her body, her voice, her existence had been debated, dissected, politicized since the moment she stepped into the spotlight. She learned early that being dominant wasn't enough. Being great wasn't enough. Being visible meant being targeted. Every dunk, every block, every championship moment came with whispers that she didn't fit someone else's idea of what women's basketball was supposed to look like. The WNBA became more than a league for Brittney. It was a refuge built by people who knew what it meant to be questioned just for showing up as themselves. She had stood on stages demanding equality. She had knelt, spoken, marched, and absorbed backlash that would have crushed players with thinner skin. When she was detained overseas, the league wrapped itself around her like armor, turning her pain into a rallying cry for humanity. Brittney didn't just survive that ordeal. She returned carrying scars the public would never fully see. In that time, the WNBA's identity hardened. Inclusion wasn't marketing language. It was survival instinct. The league became a place where queer players, non-conforming players, outspoken players carved space in a sports world that often wanted them silent. Brittney was at the center of that gravity. Not perfect, not untouched by criticism, but undeniable. That's why the name Aryna Sabalenka hit so hard. She wasn't part of the WNBA ecosystem. She hadn't lived its battles. She didn't understand its internal politics, its fragile alliances with sponsors, its constant fight to exist on its own terms. Yet her words landed with the force of an internal betrayal. When Sabalenka spoke about banning trans players from the WNBA, it felt like an outsider reaching into a house built on solidarity and lighting a match. For Brittney, it wasn't abstract. It wasn't theoretical. It wasn't a debate. It echoed too closely to the same rhetoric that had followed her for years. That some bodies don't belong, that some identities need regulating, that fairness is only fairness when it protects comfort. She had heard those arguments before, wrapped in different language, aimed at different targets. This time, it landed closer to home. The league had been here before, too. Every few seasons, a cultural flashpoint erupted. Anthem protests, pay equity, Sexuality. Politics. Each time, the WNBA paid a price. Sponsors hesitated. Media coverage sharpened. Executives balanced values against survival. Players were praised for bravery and punished for being too loud in the same breath. Brittney knew how this worked. She had watched statements get softened, language get sanitized, passion get trimmed down for optics. She had watched players asked to focus on basketball, while their lives were dragged into public discourse. So when Sabalenka's comments began trending, Brittney didn't just feel anger. She felt dread, because she knew what came next. Talk shows would frame it as a conversation. Social media would turn it into a war. People who never watched a WNBA game would suddenly become experts on its rules, its athletes, its values. Trans players, already navigating a hostile world, would be dragged into the spotlight without consent, without protection. And the league would once again be asked to prove why it deserved to stand for something. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted fast. League officials monitored reactions by the minute. PR teams drafted potential responses that said everything and nothing. Brittney could feel the weight of expectations settle onto her shoulders before anyone even asked her a question. She was a leader, a symbol, someone people looked to when things got ugly. But leadership doesn't make you immune. As the cameras turned toward her that day, Brittney carried not just her own history, but the accumulated fear of knowing how quickly words turn into policy and policy turns into erasure. She thought about teammates past and present, about the locker rooms that saved lives, about the idea that the WNBA was different, that it had to be. Sabalenka's demand didn't just challenge trans inclusion. It challenged the soul of the league Brittney had bled for. And standing there, with microphones inches from her face, she understood with terrifying clarity that whatever she said next wouldn't just be a reaction. It would be a line in the sand. And once that line was drawn, there would be no going back. The league tried to move fast, but the fire moved faster. Within hours of Sabalenka's comments ripping through timelines, WNBA executives were pulled into emergency calls that stretched past midnight. Screens filled with engagement graphs spiking like heart monitors, sponsor names flashing red beside words like risk, boycott, and brand exposure. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. This wasn't just noise. This was a pressure cooker pointed straight at the league's core values. Brittney felt it before anyone told her. Her phone stopped buzzing with support and started vibrating with requests. Can you clarify? Can you respond? Can you soften? The same people who praised her bravery suddenly needed her to be careful. Measured. Strategic. She sat in her hotel room staring at the wall, replaying her own breakdown on loop, wondering how vulnerability had once again become something to manage. The first meeting was framed as a check-in. It never is. Faces on the screen smiled tightly, voices calm in that way that means decisions are already forming. They talked about unity, about respecting diverse opinions, about not letting outside voices distract from basketball. Brittney listened, arms crossed, pulse pounding. Outside voices? She finally asked. You mean trans players who are already in this league? The silence that followed was loud enough to answer her. Social media wasn't waiting. Clips of Sabalenka's comments were stitched next to Brittney's tears, set to dramatic music, captions screaming betrayal and hypocrisy. Some fans demanded the WNBA issue an immediate condemnation. Others flooded replies insisting the league protect fairness. The comment sections became battlegrounds where trans athletes were reduced to arguments, their humanity flattened into bullet points. Brittney scrolled until her hands shook, then threw the phone onto the bed like it had burned her. On sports television, the framing shifted. Panels debated whether Brittney's reaction was too emotional, whether the league had gone too far politically, whether inviting this controversy was bad for business. The conversation stopped being about people and started being about optics. Brittney recognized the pattern instantly. This was how movements got diluted. This was how lines blurred until the original harm disappeared. Then came the first leak. An unnamed league source told a major outlet that executives were concerned Brittney's response might escalate tensions and alienate key audiences. The phrasing was surgical. It painted her as the variable, the risk factor, the instability. Brittney read the headline and felt something snap. She wasn't escalating anything. She was reacting to erasure. But the narrative was already shifting, sliding responsibility away from the comment itself and onto the woman who refused to swallow it quietly. Players noticed. Group chats lit up. Some rallied loudly behind Brittney. posting statements of solidarity that burned through timelines. Others stayed silent, afraid of being dragged into a culture war they didn't feel equipped to survive. A few posted vague messages about respecting all perspectives, language so neutral it felt like abandonment. Locker rooms grew tense. Eyes searched for allies. Trust became fragile. Behind closed doors, the pressure sharpened. Sponsors requested reassurance calls. Broadcast partners asked about potential disruptions. Someone floated the idea of a cooling-off period. Not for the comments that started it, but for Brittney's public presence. The implication was clear. Less media, fewer microphones, a step back until the storm passed. Brittney laughed when she heard it, a bitter sound. "So the solution is to hide me?" she asked. No one answered directly. That's when the shocking twist landed. A confidential memo, never meant to leave the building, hid an investigative reporter's inbox. It outlined a proposed crisis containment strategy. Bullet points, timelines, talking points. One line sat like a landmine. Recenter discourse on competitive integrity, avoid validating emotional responses. Another, identify player spokespeople aligned with neutral framing. Brittney's name appeared once, under a section titled Volatility Management. The story exploded. Headlines shifted from debate to betrayal. The league wasn't just reacting to controversy. It was attempting to steer it by sidelining the very voice that embodied its values. Fans erupted. Former players spoke out, calling it cowardice. Advocacy groups demanded answers. The WNBA released a statement claiming the memo was mischaracterized. But the damage was done. Receipts don't care about spin. Brittney was summoned again, this time in person. The room was smaller, the tone colder. They spoke about protecting her mental health, about taking space, about letting the league handle the messaging. Brittney stood up mid-sentence. "You don't get to use my pain as a reason to silence me," she said, voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "And you don't get to call it protection." Outside, cameras waited. Inside, lawyers exchanged looks. Someone warned her about consequences. Brittney nodded. She already knew them. She'd lived them. As she walked out, her phone buzzed with another alert. Sabalenka had doubled down, releasing a statement clarifying her position and insisting she was standing up for fairness. The timing was brutal. The contrast was worse. One voice amplified, polished, defended. Another scrutinized, contained, managed. Players watched it unfold in real time, realizing with growing horror what the league was willing to do to keep sponsors calm. The conflict was no longer theoretical. It had names, faces, strategies. That night, Brittney sat alone and recorded a video she wasn't sure she'd ever post. No script, no polish, just truth. She talked about belonging, about fear, about how quickly conversations about inclusion turn into systems of exclusion when money gets nervous. She stopped recording before the end, heart racing, knowing once it was out, there would be no pulling it back. Meanwhile, executives drafted contingency plans. If Brittney went public on her own terms, they'd need to respond. If players followed her lead, the situation could spiral. Someone suggested accelerating a values summit to redirect attention. Another suggested fines for unauthorized statements. The league was bracing not for disagreement, but for rebellion. The first domino tipped when a veteran player tweeted a single sentence. "If standing up for our own gets you labeled volatile, then the problem isn't the players." It went viral in minutes. Brittney watched the retweets climb and felt a mix of relief and terror. Solidarity was powerful and dangerous. The league couldn't contain all of them, but it could try to make an example of one. Her phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. "If you post that video, the fallout won't just hit you." Brittney stared at the screen, thumb hovering, realizing the fight had crossed a line. This wasn't about statements anymore. This was about control, about who gets to speak and who gets managed into silence. She opened the camera app again, heart pounding, fully aware that the next move wouldn't just define her role in this controversy. It would expose exactly how far the league was willing to go to protect itself. The video went live at 9:17 p.m., and the world tilted on its axis. Brittney didn't preface it with disclaimers or polish it with PR language. She spoke plainly, eyes steady, voice trembling only once. She talked about belonging like it was oxygen, about how leagues don't just set rules, they set who feels safe breathing inside them. She never mentioned Sabalenka by name. She didn't have to. The message was unmistakable, and that made it impossible to ignore. Within minutes, the numbers exploded. Views multiplied. Shares cascaded. Comment sections filled with raw confession and rage. Trans athletes across sports replied with stories that cracked hearts open. Parents thanked her. Former players wept on camera. And right alongside the support came the backlash, sharper and faster than before. Accusations of politicizing sports. Demands for neutrality. Calls for the league to rein her in. The league moved immediately. An internal alert instructed teams to refrain from public commentary until further guidance. A hastily scheduled press availability was announced, then delayed, then quietly reframed as a listening session. Sponsors requested updates. One threatened to pause activation, pending clarity. The phrase clarity became code for compliance. In locker rooms, the temperature rose. Some players cheered Brittney's courage, slapping lockers and hugging like a line had finally been crossed together. Others looked terrified, whispering about fines and contracts, about being labeled difficult in a league that remembered everything. Coaches avoided eye contact. Assistants took notes they pretended weren't notes. And then the second major twist detonated. A prominent sports outlet published a follow-up. Sources claimed the WNBA was considering an eligibility framework review. Not a ban, not a policy, but a review framed as a proactive response to global conversations around fairness. The timing was surgical. The effect was devastating. It looked like movement without commitment, and everyone knew what that meant. It shifted the burden from hateful demands to bureaucratic process, from people to paper. Brittney read the headline and felt cold settle into her bones. This was the pivot. Not confrontation, not defense, deferral. The league could say it was listening while opening the door to everything she feared. Her video had forced their hand, and their answer was to widen the room just enough for danger to slip in politely. Players reacted instantly. A group of veterans drafted a joint statement condemning any review that questioned inclusion. Younger players hesitated, torn between values and vulnerability. Agents flooded inboxes with warnings. Be careful. Think long-term. Don't burn bridges you still have to cross. Then came the call Brittney didn't expect. A senior executive asked to meet privately, no lawyers, no recording. The tone was softer than before, almost apologetic. He spoke about pressure from multiple stakeholders, about international markets, about the risk of setting precedents that could outpace governance. Brittney listened, unmoving. You're asking me to trust a process that starts by questioning my community's right to exist, she said. He didn't deny it. He reframed it. We're trying to protect the league. That was the moment Brittney understood the true escalation. This wasn't a reaction to Sabalenka anymore. This was a recalibration of power. The league was testing how much it could bend its values without breaking its brand. Social media sensed it instantly. Hashtags shifted from support to suspicion. Hashtag no review without rights. Hashtag processes policy. Fans dug into timelines, resurfacing past moments when reviews quietly led to rollbacks. Advocacy groups announced protests outside arenas. The pressure was no longer manageable. Behind the scenes, a fracture widened at the top. Some executives pushed for a firm statement rejecting any ban or review outright. Others argued for caution, citing legal exposure and sponsor anxiety. The room split along a familiar fault line: conviction versus comfort. The breaking point came when a leaked calendar screenshot spread online. It showed a closed-door stakeholder roundtable, scheduled with select partners. Notably absent were player representatives. The optics were catastrophic. The implication was worse. Decisions about inclusion were being discussed without the people most affected. Brittney didn't wait. She reposted the screenshot with a single line. You don't get to decide our humanity without us. The league's phone lines lit up. Media requested comment every 30 seconds. A sponsor issued a vague statement reaffirming respect for all athletes, which pleased no one. A rival league publicly endorsed inclusion, drawing a brutal comparison. The WNBA's silence grew heavier, louder. Inside one front office, a draft statement circulated that changed everything. It proposed distancing the league from individual player activism to preserve competitive focus. It suggested reminding players of conduct clauses regarding public messaging. Someone added a note in the margin. This may escalate. They were right. Players learned about the draft within the hour. Screenshots flew. Group chats ignited. A veteran star threatened to sit out games. Another hinted at a coordinated media blackout. Coaches begged for calm. Calm was gone. Brittney felt the ground shifting under her feet. Support was real, but so was the risk. She knew the league could fine her, sideline her, frame her as the problem until the noise died down. She also knew something else now. They were afraid. Afraid of unity. Afraid of precedent. Afraid of what would happen if the players spoke together instead of one at a time. Late that night, Brittney received a message from a trusted ally inside the league. They're considering fast-tracking the review announcement tomorrow to regain control. Tomorrow. The clock was no longer abstract. It was ticking loud enough to hear. Brittney stared at her phone, heart racing, knowing the next move had to be decisive. If the review was announced without resistance, it would legitimize the very rhetoric she was fighting. If players walked out, the fallout would be seismic. She opened a new message thread and typed 3 words to a dozen players across teams. "We decide now." Read receipts popped up one by one. Outside, the debate raged. Inside, a line was forming, not between opinions, but between those willing to risk everything and those hoping the storm would pass. By morning, the league would either reclaim its soul or reveal exactly how negotiable it had always been. The announcement hit at noon, exactly as predicted, wrapped in language so careful it felt dangerous. The WNBA will initiate an inclusive stakeholder review to examine competitive integrity frameworks. No ban, no promise, no protection, just enough ambiguity to let fear breathe. The fallout was instant and merciless. Outside arenas, protesters gathered with signs that shook in the heat. Inside, ushers whispered nervously as chants bled through concrete walls. Social media stopped arguing and started organizing. Trans athletes shared stories of locker rooms that saved their lives. Parents posted videos of kids in jerseys asking why adults were debating whether they belonged. Sponsors were tagged relentlessly. Timelines flooded until brand managers locked comments and issued hollow reassurances. Brittney felt it all crash at once. Interviews she'd agreed to were canceled for safety. Others were pushed aggressively, hosts circling with loaded questions about fairness, biology, and whether she regretted making it personal. She didn't regret anything, but she was exhausted in a way sleep couldn't touch. Every time she opened her phone, she braced for another piece of herself to be pulled apart by strangers. The locker rooms fractured further. Some players cried openly. Others went numb. A few tried to joke through it and failed. Coaches struggled to keep practices normal while players checked phones between drills, eyes red, hands shaking. One team canceled media availability entirely after a heated argument spilled into the hallway. The league called it a scheduling adjustment. No one believed that. Brittney's jersey became a symbol overnight. Fans wore it in solidarity. Others filmed themselves burning it. The duality was violent. She watched one clip in silence, fire licking at her name, and then another where a trans teenager held that same jersey to their chest and said, "She made me feel seen." The whiplash made her chest ache. Former players entered the fray with sharpened memories. Some recounted eras when silence was survival. Others admitted they wished they'd spoken sooner. Media panels stacked themselves with voices who'd never set foot in a WNBA locker room, debating lives as hypotheticals. When trans athletes were invited on, they were asked to explain themselves, to educate, to absorb disbelief with grace. Brittney felt fury simmer. The burden always found the same shoulders. The league's internal temperature spiked. Executives tracked sentiment hourly. The word containment appeared again. Someone suggested accelerating a charity initiative to recenter positivity. Someone else warned that it would look like deflection. Both were right. Neither addressed the harm. Players began making choices. One posted a statement refusing to participate in any review that questioned inclusion. Another quietly deleted past Pride posts, fearing backlash. A third announced a mental health break and disappeared from timelines altogether. The spectrum of responses revealed the truth. This wasn't a single issue. It was a stress fracture running through the entire ecosystem. Brittney was asked, again, to step back from public appearances. This time, the request came with concern dressed as care. "Your safety matters. The temperature is too high. Let us take it from here." She recognized the pattern and declined without raising her voice. "If I disappear," she said, "the message will be clear." Fans noticed her refusal and rallied harder. Ticket sales surged in cities planning demonstrations. Others dipped where protests were announced. The economic data became another battlefield, wielded by commentators to argue values versus viability. Brittney hated that language. Viability for whom? Values at whose expense? A late-night show invited her on and promised a respectful conversation. She went. The host asked one thoughtful question, then pivoted to devil's advocate. Brittney answered anyway, steady and precise, refusing to let rhetoric flatten people. Clips spread. Support poured in. So did threats. Security was increased at games. Teammates checked on each other like family during a storm. The most devastating blow came quietly. A trans player, previously out of the spotlight, deactivated all accounts and released a brief note through an advocacy group. The noise has made it impossible to feel safe. The league acknowledged the note with a single sentence about respecting privacy. Brittney read it and felt tears burn. This was the cost. Not theoretical. Immediate. By the weekend, the review announcement had morphed into a referendum on the league itself. Was it different, or just better at branding? Was inclusion a value or a slogan? Every silence felt like an answer. Every deflection felt like confirmation. Brittney stood at midcourt before a home game and listened to the mixed reaction, applause colliding with boos. She placed her hand over the logo, breathing through the noise, knowing the cameras would read whatever they wanted into the gesture. When the ball tipped, the game felt secondary, but it mattered anyway. Visibility mattered. Presence mattered. After the final buzzer, she walked past reporters without stopping. In the tunnel, her phone buzzed with a message from a player she'd texted days earlier. 3 words finally returned. I'm with you. The fallout hadn't burned out. It had hardened. And somewhere between fear and resolve, a collective choice was beginning to form. One that would either force the league to draw a clear line or expose just how willing it was to blur one. The vote wasn't supposed to exist. That's what they told everyone. No decision, no policy, no direction yet, just a review. But Brittney learned the truth the way she always did now. Sideways, whispered dangerous. A player rep slipped her a screenshot taken too quickly to be safe. Calendar invite. Private distribution. Subject line stripped of softness. Framework direction. Executive alignment. The meeting had already happened. What made Brittney's hands shake wasn't the title. It was the attachments. Draft language. Conditional clauses. A roadmap that didn't ban anyone outright, but quietly empowered teams to apply eligibility standards pending final guidance. It created space for exclusion without ever naming it. Plausible deniability engineered line by line. The kind of policy that let leaders claim neutrality while harm did the dirty work. And then she saw the kicker. A contingency plan labeled public stabilization. It outlined scenarios if players resisted. Fines for unauthorized demonstrations. Schedule flexibility to minimize disruption. Media protocols to redirect focus to on-court performance. Brittney's name appeared again, this time under high-visibility risk. Not a person. A variable. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. This wasn't indecision. It was strategy. Paired with the screenshot was a message from the same rep. They want to announce a direction Monday. Before players can unify. Monday was 2 days away. Brittney called a late-night meeting, unofficial, off the books. No staff. No executives. Just players crammed into a quiet room, phones face down, fear thick enough to taste. Some came shaking. Some came angry. Some came knowing exactly what was at stake. Brittney didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She showed them the documents. The room went still. This lets them say they didn't ban anyone, a veteran whispered, while letting teams do it anyway. And if we speak, someone asked. They punish us for disruption, Brittney said calmly, and say they're protecting the game. The silence broke into chaos. Voices overlapped. Tears spilled. One player admitted she couldn't risk her contract. Another said she couldn't live with herself if she stayed quiet. A third confessed she'd already been warned by her agent to stay invisible. Brittney listened to all of it, absorbing the weight of what unity actually cost. Then someone said the word no one expected. Strike. The air changed instantly. A strike would be nuclear. Games canceled. Sponsors furious. Fans divided. The league exposed in daylight it couldn't control. It would force a response, but it would also put every career on the line. Brittney felt the responsibility crush her chest. This wasn't just about values anymore. It was about survival. Before a decision could form, her phone buzzed again. A message from an executive who hadn't spoken publicly once during the chaos. If you proceed with coordinated action, the league will respond accordingly. No threat. No denial. Just certainty. Minutes later, a major outlet broke news of an exclusive interview scheduled for the next morning. Aryna Sabalenka, prime placement, framed as a clarification and bridge-building conversation. Brittney laughed bitterly. While players were being managed into silence, the original demand was being amplified, polished, legitimized. The optics were brutal. Brittney stood and addressed the room. "They're betting we won't risk everything," she said. "They're betting fear beats solidarity." She paused, voice steady. "They're wrong, but only if we decide together." Phones lit up across the room. Messages from teammates who couldn't attend. From retired legends. From advocacy groups ready to stand publicly. From agents panicking. From fans promising to show up. The network was there, fragile, imperfect, real. Then came the final twist. A reporter reached out privately with confirmation. The league planned to announce the framework direction Monday morning, before any player statement could go live. They were racing the clock. Control versus conscience. Whoever spoke first would define the narrative. Brittney felt the moment crystallize. There would be no perfect choice. Only a clear one. She typed a message into the group chat that had grown too large to manage. "If we move before them." Read receipts flooded in. Outside, the night was quiet, unaware that a league stood on the edge of its own reflection. Brittney stared at the dark, heart pounding, knowing that by sunrise, silence would no longer be an option. Because either the WNBA would draw an unmistakable line, or it would reveal, once and for all, how easily its values could be negotiated when power felt threatened. This is where watching turns into responsibility. What's unfolding around Brittney Griner isn't just a controversy. It's a test of whether the WNBA's values exist only when they're convenient. A review disguised as neutrality. Silence sold as patience. Power asking you to wait while it redraws the lines of who belongs. Fans don't get to say this isn't their fight. Every ticket, every stream, every trending clip fuels the machine deciding whether inclusion is protected or negotiated. If the loudest voices are allowed to define humanity as a framework issue, the damage won't stop at one policy or one season. It will echo in locker rooms, youth leagues, and futures that never get a chance to exist. This moment demands more than opinions. It demands pressure. Demand transparency about the so-called review. Demand player representation at every table where decisions are made. Demand the league state, clearly and without loopholes, that trans players belong. Not as a talking point, not as a debate, but as a fact. Support the players who are risking everything to say what should never have been controversial. Follow their statements. Amplify their words. Push back when narratives try to recenter comfort over lives. Call out media outlets that platform harm under the guise of both sides. Silence is not neutral. It never has been. If you love this league, prove it by holding it accountable. Values aren't proven by hashtags alone. They're proven when money gets nervous and power feels exposed. The WNBA has built its identity on being different, on standing where other leagues stayed quiet. That history is watching now. What happens next will define more than a season. It will define who feels safe walking into a gym, pulling on a jersey, and believing they belong there. The clock is ticking, and the next announcement will try to move on without resolution. Don't let it, because if this line gets blurred now, it won't stop here. And if the people who made this league what it is aren't protected when it matters most, then the question won't be what the WNBA stands for. It will be who it was willing to leave behind.